Hello, my name is Nicole Mashburn. Oops, I get to the beginning, sorry. And I'm going to talk to you today about cells and basically generalized cell structure. So what a cell is and what it looks like and the parts of the cell that you kind of need to be familiar with. So let's start. What is a cell? What does that mean? There's something called the cell theory, and basically what that says is the cell is the smallest structural and functional living unit, okay? And that organisms depend on these cells to either work individually or collectively. So, okay, that was fancy. What does that mean? Okay, so basically we know there are one-cell organisms out there. Think of an amoeba or a bacteria. There are things that survive in the world just as one single cell. So it's the smallest thing, it's as small as you can get, structural, and it can function on its own and live by itself. Okay, think of, like I said, an amoeba or a bacteria. Now if you have an organism, okay, if you've talked about body organization, you know you've got atoms, and then that makes chemicals, and chemicals make cells, and cells make tissues, and tissues make organs, and organs make organ systems, and organ systems make organisms. Okay, so if you have an organism, you have to have all kinds of cells, and some of them will work individually, and some of them will work together. So again, what does that mean? Well, think about like a white blood cell or a red blood cell. These kind of do their thing. The little cells are going through the vessels of your body, and they're kind of working independently. They're doing their own thing. Red blood cells are helping exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, and white blood cells are out there helping to fight off infection. And they can kind of do their own thing. But sometimes cells have to work together. So think about if you have, here's an arm, here's a hand. I'm an awful artist, guys, so y'all just have to get used to that. So here's your arm, there's your hand. Okay? If you want to move your arm, if you want to contract a muscle, that's not just one muscle cell. That's a bunch of muscle cells put together to form a big muscle. So those muscle cells have to work together in order to cause an arm to move or contract. So cells can work individually or collectively. Now we have a ton, I think over 200 different types of cells in our body, different types of cells. We have things like erythrocytes, that's just a red blood cell. We have fibroblasts, we have epithelial cells. So these are all cells that basically connect body parts. Fibroblasts are parts of connective tissue, kind of the glue that holds you together. Erythrocytes, they transport gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Epithelial cells are lining cells. You'll find them inside your mouth, your digestive system, things like that. You have cells that move stuff, like skeletal muscle that moves bone. When a muscle contracts, it's usually moving a bone. You have cardiac muscle that's, as it's pumping, it's moving blood. You may have cells that store nutrients, like a fat cell. The fancy word for fat cell is adipocyte. You may have cells that fight off disease, like those white blood cells I talked about. There's also some cells that are called macrophages, and you see the suffix phage, that means to eat, and so a macrophage is just a big cell eater. So if there's something that needs to be gotten rid of, these macrophages will invade an area and basically eat away whatever needs to be dealt with. You've got cells that are for information and control, like your nerve cells. We call these neurons. And you have cells for reproduction, like the sperm, or in the female, that's sperm are in the male, the oocyte. You may have already picked up on this. Have you noticed there's something called cyte in several of these words? Adipocyte, erythrocyte, oocyte. Cyte, C-Y-T-E, C-Y-T-E, means cell. So whenever you see something cyte, that means it's some kind of a cell. Now you'll notice, even though we have all these different kind of cells, and they're all different shapes, these are square, these are round, these are long and spindly, these are spiky, they all have some things that are in common. So you can take what's called a generalized cell, and you can say all cells have some things that are in common. And they all have three basic parts. They all have a plasma membrane, they all have a cytoplasm, and they all have a nucleus. The plasma membrane is just the boundary. It's the flexible outer boundary of the cell. Can you ever think of a cell that might be rigid? Plant cells. Plant cells are rigid. So you may, in a plant cell, they have what's called a cell wall. Instead of that cell membrane, they have a rigid cell wall that we don't have as humans or animals. And so that's what gives plants their rigidity, that cell wall. But we have cell membranes, and they're very flexible, so your cells can change shape. They all have a cytoplasm, which is basically an intracellular fluid that contains the organelles. And so these are basically, you might want to say, the baby organs inside the cell. Okay, that's what organelles mean, like little bitty things like mitochondria, nucleus, Golgi body, things like that, which we'll talk about in just a second. And they all have a nucleus, which is the control center. And what's in your nucleus? That's your DNA. It's your genetic blueprint. So this is just kind of a picture of a general cell. No particular cell, but just kind of one that shows all the basic parts of the cells. And the things I've got outlined in red are kind of the ones that I'm going to go into more detail about in this talk. And that's kind of the things you need to be responsible for this class. As you move into some of the other classes, 202, or into some other units, you may learn about some of the other parts of the cell. But for right now, let's just stick with the basics. You have the plasma membrane, which is the stuff that covers the outside. You have your nucleus. You have your mitochondria, which are these orange hot dog looking things. You have the cytoplasm, which is this yellow goo that holds everything together. You have a little Golgi apparatus, which is this green thing. We're going to talk about what all these do. And you have something called an endoplasmic reticulum. And it's this kind of reticulum means web-like, so it's kind of a web-like structure. And it's either going to be smooth endoplasmic reticulum or rough endoplasmic reticulum. And if you'll notice, the rough has these little dots on it, and those dots are the ribosomes. So let's go and talk about each one of these things in a little more detail about what they do. Okay, the first thing is the plasma membrane. And when you talk about membrane transport, you're going to get a whole lot more information about the plasma membrane. So I'm just going to go a little bit of detail about it. You're going to get a whole lot more detail in another video. Basically what it is, it's a bimolecular layer of lipids and proteins that is constantly changing. Okay, so if you think back to high school biology maybe, the cell membrane, basically it's just a bunch of lipids, phospholipids, that kind of line up, their tails touch. They have heads and tails. And they have a certain polarity, a certain charge that allows them to line up like this. And so they basically make a two-layer bimolecular layer that forms your plasma membrane. And they kind of float. It kind of moves. So it's always changing. And there's usually some proteins associated with that. And those proteins may have a role. They may be a transport protein. They may be a signaling protein. They have some role. Again, we'll go into more detail on that later. But the cell membrane, the plasma membrane, is really involved in cell activity. One of the main jobs it has is basically just to separate. It separates the intracellular, or what's inside the cell, from the extracellular, what's outside the cell. You may also see the term interstitial, and that's just the extracellular fluid that surrounds the cells. That's just another word that you may see when you talk about extracellular fluid. So it's just a boundary. All right, so you've got what's outside the cell, so what's inside the cell, and that's where that cytoplasm is. Okay, so that's basically the stuff between the plasma membrane and the nucleus. And it's made up of basically three different parts. The cytosol, which is kind of a watery solution. It's got protein, salt, sugars. It's kind of jelly-ish, actually. It's kind of thick. You've got your cytoplasmic organelles, so all those baby organs are kind of floating around in that cytosol. The organelles float around in the cytosol. And then you have some little inclusions. And I didn't show you. Let me go back to this picture. These little things. It's little bubbles. These are little inclusions. And so they can be anywhere from, they may hold an enzyme, they have all kind of functions. They may have a pigment, they may be a granule of glycogen, which is the way we store sugar. It may be a fat drop. It may have some enzymes. So whatever, just some little inclusions that are involved in whatever cell you're talking about. All right, then we have the nucleus. And that's where DNA is. That's where your genetic library is. That's where your blueprint is. It responds to signals and kind of says, okay, what do we got to make? Basically what your DNA does is it codes for proteins. So your nucleus is kind of like the brain of the cell. Okay, so signal goes to the nucleus, says what we need, and then the nucleus says, okay, we need to make some protein. Most cells are uninucleate. That means they have one nucleus. There is one type of cell that doesn't have a nucleus. It's called the red blood cell or the erythrocyte, and it's anucleate when it's mature. When the red blood cell is being formed, when you're making more red blood cells, they do have a nucleus. But then right before you're ready to use them, right before they go out into your bloodstream, they kind of expel their nucleus, and they don't need it anymore. Any idea why? What's a red blood cell do? It's for oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. You want to get as much oxygen in that red blood cell as you possibly can, so you don't need a nucleus. It's just in the way. It's just taking up space. And so red blood cells, they stay in your body. You use them about 21 days, get rid of them, and make some more. So they don't have a nucleus. The reason you have to get rid of them is because they don't have a nucleus. They can't repair themselves. So one of the things that the nucleus does is allow a cell to maintain itself and repair itself. You have muscle cells and some bone cells and some liver cells are multinucleate. That means they have more than one nucleus. So this is just a picture of the nucleus. So here you've got your nucleus, and you've got a thing called a nucleolus and chromatin. Again, you'll get a little more detail in that as we go along. Right now, nucleus is your control center. Okay, you have your mitochondria. Okay, and these are those like little hot dogs. And they are where you make your cells ATP. Okay, they provide the ATP for energy. That's the form of energy that we use. And if you've watched your video on cellular respiration, which I hope you have by now, you realize that we make ATP in the mitochondria. All right, this is the endoplasmic reticulum. Again, there's basically a smooth ER, a rough ER, and the ribosomes. The ribosomes is basically where you have a little protein and a ribosomal RNA. And this is one of the functional, where you make a protein. So it's the site of protein synthesis. When you watch the video on protein synthesis, you'll see more about what ribosomes do. Ribosomes are associated with the rough ER, so again, that has to do with the manufacture of proteins. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum usually has some kind of an enzymatic function. Remember what an enzyme is? Usually something that ends with the suffix ase, usually something that breaks something down, speeds up a reaction, a catalyst. And so there's usually some kind of enzyme function going on in the smooth ER. All right, the Golgi apparatus. And it's kind of once a protein is made, so you have a protein, so here's some protein synthesis going on up here. And it's kind of the protein that you're wanting to use, it's kind of immature. It's not ready to be used yet. It's basically got to be modified and then packaged so that you can now use the protein. So basically what happens is the protein that needs to be modified and packaged leaves the rough ER, goes into the Golgi, and basically is modified and then packaged inside the Golgi and then released either somewhere in the cell, to the cell wall, or to a vesicle, one of those little balloons that can then send it outside of the cell. So like I said, some of the proteins will be incorporated into this plasma membrane, and some will leave the cell via what's called exocytosis, and you'll learn about that when we talk about cell membrane transport. So again, the Golgi is your protein modification and packaging. The cytoskeleton. Remember cyte, that means cell. So basically there's some structure to the cell, things that kind of hold the cell, it gives us a particular shape. And you have things called microtubules, microfilaments, and intermediate filaments. And you'll talk about a few of these when we talk about the muscle contraction. You'll talk about some of these microfilaments when we talk about the muscles. You also have some things that stick off the cell, some extensions. You have cilia and flagella. Cilia are usually multi. Okay, you have little fine hair-like, and a flagella is usually one long extension. These allow for movement. Okay, so they basically will have a little whip-like movement. And wherever you find cilia, that usually moves stuff across the cell surface. So in your lungs, lining your lungs. If you ever had to cough up something, some kind of like mucus, well, basically you trap dust and stuff inside your lungs, and you've got to get rid of that so your lungs don't become too heavy, and so are blocked, and you can't exchange gases anymore. So the cilia will basically kind of brush or sweep out whatever's in your lungs and kind of sweep it up into your bronchus and your trachea so that you can cough it out. Flagella are usually a long tail that allow for like some kind of movement. So cilia are usually cells that don't move anywhere, but they move something. And then flagella are usually on a cell that actually moves the cell, like a sperm. And then again, there's another one, another extension. These are called microvilli. And don't get these confused with cilia. Cilia are little hair-like extensions. So it kind of looks like that. So here's the cell. Okay, but here's the cell, the plasma membrane, and the little cilia are kind of sticking up off the plasma membrane. In microvilli, the plasma membrane actually is making these little finger-like projections. So these little projections of the plasma membrane. And you see these in areas that you're trying to increase or where you have absorption. So what it does is it increases the surface area. So, for example, in the small intestine where you absorb a lot of nutrients. If your small intestine looked like this, then this is all the surface area you would have for absorption. And it would take a long, long time to absorb enough nutrients. Your small intestine would either have to be really, really long, or food would have to stay in there a long, long time for you to absorb as much nutrients as you needed. But if you do these little microvilli, that increases the amount of surface area you have so you can have faster absorption. You don't have to have as long of a small intestine, and food can be absorbed more readily. Okay, so that's all you need to know about a generalized cell. Again, there'll be some more detail on the plasma membrane, and then we're going to talk about protein synthesis later, and it'll tell us a little bit more about ribosomes in the plasmic reticulum. If you haven't watched the cellular respiration video, make sure you go back and do that, and that kind of tells you a little bit more about what's going on in the mitochondria. All right, keep going. Good luck.